Mate, what do I need to win?
2 triple 20s and a bullseye.
Good luck. You know, Rupert, guys have underestimated me my entire life. And for years, I never understood why. It used to really bother me. But then one day, I was driving my little boy to school, and I saw this quote by Walt Whitman. It was painted on the wall there. It said, "Be curious, not judgmental." I like that. So I get back in my car, and I'm driving to work, and all of a sudden, it hits me. All them fellas that used to belittle me, not a single one of them were curious. You know, they thought they had everything all figured out, and so they judged everything, and they judged everyone. And I realized that they're underestimating me. Who I was had nothing to do with it. Because if they were curious, they would ask questions. You know? Questions like, have you played a lot of darts, Ted? Which I would have answered, yes, sir. Every Sunday afternoon at a sports bar with my father from age 10 until I was 16 when he passed away. Barbecue sauce.
We're going to go ahead and dismiss our kids for Children's Church. They're going to head out the back there and head over to the other building. That's 3 years old through 2nd grade. So they're going to go have a fun time over there. I love that show. I love Ted Lasso. I've used that clip before. Last time we talked about parables, actually, about a year ago. So Ashley asked me before I came up here, are you redoing a sermon? I said, no, just a video. Sermon's new. Same video, though. As I was rewatching that clip this week, the last time I used it, season 2 had not come out yet. And if you watch Ted Lasso, that clip hits differently after season 2. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you should watch Ted Lasso. So, but good to see everybody here this morning. We're glad that you're here. As Tom said at the beginning, we've got a couple of small groups that are meeting today for lunch. So we've got Bible classes after this, and then small groups meeting for lunch. So all kinds of opportunities to get to know people and talk and study and eat good food and all that kind of stuff. And next week, we've got more good stuff, more good food. The Trino Pizza trailer is going to be on site next week for anyone who's here. Free pizza with worship next week, so that works out pretty well. And we're encouraging everyone to invite someone to join you that Sunday for worship. In churches that I grew up with, we would have called those Friends Sundays. Anybody have Friends Sundays growing up? We used to have Friends Sundays. So you can see that kind of as a Friends Sunday. Very casual. We're always pretty casual anyways, but next week is on Tailgate Sunday is what we're calling it. Come in your favorite sports team, college gear, casual wear, whatever. There'll be some games and stuff set up outside after worship. Pizza will be out there, and it'll be a fun Sunday. And then we've got the weekend event after that as well. So lots of good stuff coming up. We hope you'll join us for some of that. Hey, John, can you turn that computer back down? It's like buzzing behind me. It's going to bug me the whole sermon. Thanks. We had a couple of false starts this morning, but then the band came up and we're still false starting. So we've got people getting used to new roles and all kinds of stuff. But man, the band brought it today, and we had some singers here this morning. That was amazing. So. Good to be here worshiping together this morning. So the purpose of that clip, in that clip, Ted says, be curious, not judgmental. And I think one of the things that clip shows us is that curiosity really invites us and in many cases requires asking questions. That's really what curiosity is, I think, at its core. It's being willing to ask questions and be open to new information and different perspectives. And so I mentioned last week that I think the parables are an invitation to curiosity. They're an invitation to explore and to think about what Jesus might have to say to us in these stories that are sometimes pretty direct and obvious, and sometimes they're vague, and sometimes there's layers to each of those things. And so this morning I want us to think about how do we read the parables in a way that is curious about what Jesus might have to say to us? Well, in part, I think, as Ted shows us in that clip, curiosity asks a lot of questions. And so I think it's helpful for us to read these stories and be willing to ask some questions. So that's what we're going to do today, so just be ready for that. We're going to be in a parable in Matthew 13 this morning. All of it's going to be on the screen, but if you want to turn in your Bible or on your phone, you can do that. Matthew 13 has several parables, and we're going to look at the first one that Jesus tells there. We're going to pick up in verse 3 here in just a minute. But before we get to this parable, just to kind of set the scene for a minute, in Matthew 13, Jesus and his disciples are hanging out around a lake, basically, and a large crowd starts to gather. And so Jesus ends up getting out on a boat and kind of standing on this boat almost as a stage or a podium as he's speaking to the crowd. And then as it tells us here in verse 3, it says he told them many things in parables. And so here's the first one then that Matthew tells us about. He says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came up and ate it. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Now, shortly after this parable, it says the disciples came up and asked Jesus, Jesus, why do you always talk to the people in parables? Which I imagine is the nice, polite way of saying, Jesus, do you know that no one knows what you're talking about? Do you know that you're just confusing people in the way that you speak? And so Jesus talks to him. He's like, well, it's because the secrets have been hidden for some people, given to others. Basically, everybody's not ready to hear all this stuff. And then he says, I tell you what, though, I'm going to tell you what this parable is about. And so this is good because we have an explanation for this parable, which is nice. Jesus doesn't give us explanations for all the parables, but he does for this one. And so he tells the disciples what this parable means. So if you skip down a little bit, this starts in, I think, verse 18. Yeah, verse 18. He says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke out the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. So there we have the parable. We have Jesus' nice and tidy explanation. It's a parable about a farmer who goes out and sows some seed that lands in various types of soil or ground, and the place where it lands, the environment in which the seed lands, has a direct impact then on what happens to that seed and whether or not it grows. Jesus then directly connects that to different ways that people receive or hear the message of the kingdom. And I think, traditionally, this parable has often been seen as a story about different types of people and the ways that different types of people each sort of respond to or receive the message of the kingdom or the gospel message, which may very well be what Jesus has in mind. And with that reading of this parable, we are then kind of prompted to consider something like, which type of soil or ground do we find ourselves in? I remember when I first, some of my earliest memories of preachers preaching about this parable, there would usually be a question like, which type of seed are you, or which type of soil or ground are you in, and how do you go about cultivating your environment and the soil that you're in to lead to growth and so that you can have a faith that's enduring, questions like that, which are good questions. And I think those are questions that are good, that we should be thinking about. But I also wonder if curiosity and exploration could reveal another way of thinking about this parable. And I think that there is. And so to help us think in that direction, I want us to think about another question then. As Jesus was reading through the different types of soil, I wonder how many of those types of soil can you identify with, or have you experienced yourself being in at some point in life? Could you relate to the different types of soil that Jesus was talking about? So, for instance, Jesus says, when anyone hears the word about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in the heart. So have you ever heard something that you didn't quite understand? Because you didn't understand it, you didn't know what to do with it, so the message didn't stick? I mean, it's pretty hard for the message to stick if you don't understand it. I've been that type of soil. I've been there. Jesus keeps going. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So has anyone ever had a mountaintop moment? In youth ministry, we would have called this a camp high. If you've ever been to summer camp or had a kid that went away to summer camp, you come back just on fire. I'm ready to take on the world for God until that first day of school or your boss makes you mad or whatever it is, right? And then all the other thoughts come back up. Last week, I played a sort of a bit video at the beginning of the sermon from a friend of mine named Doug. Doug was a kind of a youth ministry mentor of mine, and he told me after my first summer in youth ministry, we were at the same church. He told me after my first summer of youth ministry, he was like, never make decisions about the ministry or your future at the end of summer. He said, you'll be exhausted, the kids will be ready for anything, and it just doesn't lead to good decisions. Because camp highs are real things. Like, we have these moments, they're just mountaintop moments, and we just overcome with joy, and then stuff comes in and squelches it, and it kind of goes away. So yeah, I've been that type of seed. I've been in rocky ground. Jesus continues. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. So have you ever worried about something to the point that it negatively impacted your faith or your connection to God? Have you ever been overly concerned about finances or material possessions? The answer is yes. I'll answer that one for you. Yes, we all have been there. We're that type of soil we're in that type of soil at some points. We all find ourselves among thorns. And then Jesus ends with the fruitful seed and soil. He says, but the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop. And hopefully we can all point to these moments in our lives as well. Moments where our faith was able to have an impact on someone else or was able to sustain us through a difficult part of life or some storm or trial that was going on in our lives. Or when we were able to cultivate an environment that helped us to stay connected to God, whether this was through relationships or spiritual habits or whatever it might be. There are these moments that we experience as well. We've been in this type of soil as well, hopefully. And so I think if we're to kind of dig into this parable, I think we find that many of us have experienced ourselves as different kinds of seed in different kinds of soil in different moments and different seasons of life. And it's not always this like upward trajectory where we start out as kind of rocky soil and then we mature to being the good soil. Sometimes the rocky soil comes after moments where we're in good soil. It's up and down. It's not a linear path towards maturation and growing in our faith. I think we find that most of us have been planted in different circumstances and different soil types, which have produced different results at different moments and seasons of life. And in fact, there have likely been moments that revealed something new about something that we once thought we understood fairly well, which led us then to understand whatever it was in a completely new way. And this parable is about understanding the message of the kingdom and what that produces within us. And I'm quite confident in saying that none of us here have a full or complete understanding of the message of the kingdom. We're all still growing, we're all maturing, we're all still trying to cultivate that type of environment that we find ourselves in. So what if this parable could be read as an exploration of the ways in which each of us receive the message of God, receive the message of the kingdom, and understand it differently in different seasons of life? And furthermore, if we view the parable that way, what are we supposed to do with it? And are there different questions that we could ask of it? So, with that in mind, I want to look at a certain part of Jesus' explanation again, because I think there's a bit of an answer, or a bit of something that, at least to me, I think kind of can stoke our curiosities, hidden almost in plain sight in Jesus' explanation. And this is something that I never really thought much about this before, leading up to this series. I wish I knew where it was now because I could give this person credit, but I found this on the great resource that is Twitter when someone was commenting on this parable, and I was like, oh, I never really paid that much attention to that either, and then I couldn't go back and find the tweet. So full disclosure that I did get this from somebody else. But interestingly, I think, this is one of the few parables that Jesus gives a title. Like, Jesus doesn't give most of his parables titles. He doesn't say, now I'm going to tell you the story of the Good Samaritan. No, he just starts telling a story. He says, there was once a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And so, like, the Good Samaritan is a title that tradition has given that story, that translators have given that story that's kind of been passed down as tradition over the years. It wasn't a title or kind of a headline that Jesus gave that story. But in his explanation for this parable in Matthew 13, Jesus essentially gives us a title for it, which I think is very helpful and probably gives us a lens through which it would be helpful to view this parable and some things that Jesus might want us to see or to notice about what he ends up talking about. And based on how we tend to read or interpret or apply this parable, I think we might be tempted to name this parable something like parable of the seeds, or parable of the different types of soil. You may actually hear it kind of referred to or titled that way in some other places. But that's not what Jesus calls it. Jesus calls it the parable of the sower, which seems pretty odd once you read the rest of the parable. The rest of even his explanation focuses mostly on the different types of ground or the different seeds that end up in these different types of ground. As I read this quote from one author this week, it said, although the story is usually called the parable of the sower, the focus is not so much on the sower, but on the soils. And again, that's usually true. It's true in how we talk about it, and it's true even to some extent in Jesus' explanation, where the focus seems to be more on the soil. But Jesus is the one who calls it the parable of the sower. And so maybe entitling it that, Jesus is trying to help us, give us a lens for how we're to view this story. Maybe Jesus is calling our attention elsewhere in how we view and read this story. And so perhaps in our own reflections on this parable, we would do well to remember that Jesus envisions this first and foremost as a parable about a sower. And so what I want us to do now, we're going to reread that parable, and I want us to reread it with this lens in mind and with this question in mind, that if I'm thinking about this primarily as a parable about a sower, how might that change the way that I read it? So let's read it again. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let him hear. So I wonder if there's anything that we hear different reading it through that lens. For me, when I read it through that lens, the farmer almost starts to seem reckless. The farmer all of a sudden seems almost wasteful, we might say. I mean, what type of disciplined, resourceful farmer just goes out scattering seed in places where he probably knows it's not going to have much effect? Why go out and throw it on the path in rocky places? Why throw it amongst thorns? Like a farmer knows this isn't going to produce anything. Is this like a amateur farmer? Is this some young kid out there just like throwing seed wherever? Is Jesus' point that God is a bad farmer and doesn't know what he's doing? It doesn't seem like that's the point he's trying to make. So what might Jesus be wanting us to see by this farmer who just goes out scattering seed willy-nilly wherever it might land? And I think part of what Jesus wants us to see here is that regardless of the season that we find ourselves in, regardless of the condition of our heart, God keeps scattering seed. God is someone who scatters seed and loves and is gracious with liberality and abandon and recklessness that from a human perspective sometimes just doesn't make much sense. God is someone who continues to reach out to us in the times when we are struggling to understand. He's someone who continues to reach out to us in love in the times when we find ourselves amongst thorns. He continues to reach out to us in his love and offer us his grace and redemption and love in times when things are just rocky in our lives. I think this is a story about a God who loves with reckless abandon and who never stops reaching out to his children who he loves. And when we read it that way, I think it helps us, it's encouraging to me at least, and a reminder of the God who loves us and isn't going to give up on us. What if this parable is about a God who keeps scattering seed despite our failures, our mistakes, our tendency to get distracted, our selfishness, our lack of understanding? What if this is a parable about a God who pursues you regardless of what season of life you find yourself in? What if this is a parable about a God who keeps attempting to reach out in love when it feels like the world has taken everything from you and choked the joy out of life? What if it's a story about a sower whose love is so boundless and relentless that he sows seed without regard for where it lands? He just scatters seed everywhere. How would that cause us to reflect differently on this story and what it might have in mind for us? Those are simply questions I would like to leave us with this morning. Each Sunday we spend time in communion and we spend time reflecting on God's love for us as displayed in Christ. We share in communion every Sunday, and so in just a minute we're going to pray a prayer of confession that we pray, and the band's going to come and play a song for us. As the communion trays are passed, you're welcome to take a piece of the bread and eat of it as the plates are passed. Same with the cup as it comes. You can just take that, drink it, put it back in the tray as it comes past if you want to do that. You can also hold on to them and take them whenever you're ready to do so, whatever works out best for you. But this is a time where we remember God's love for us as displayed to us in the sending of his Son. It's a time when we remember that God keeps reaching out to us, even to the extent of sending Christ into the world to show us a picture of God's love and who God is, to die for us, and to be resurrected to new life.